Science-backed kettlebell training. Is the kettlebell a trend or is it legit? I don't think that scientific studies are the only reason why you should consider a training tool legit or a trend. But at the end of the day, because science always catches up a little bit later, but at the end of the day, you still want to have some evidence-based practice and see what the data is saying. And in this video, I'm going to talk about over 40 studies that I've explored concerning muscle, fat loss, aging, and performance, and what the literature really says. I'm not going to break it down to the fullest because this is too much of a complex video and it's too much of an academic level, which is not the idea. I want to make it simple and have you understand it as quickly as possible, and then maybe use it for your own good, for your own training, or even for your own practice. There's one particular study that I want to talk about a little bit more in detail. That's McGill's swing, snatch, and suitcase carry study, because this is the one particular study that I took a lot away from, and this is the one that we're going to highlight at the end of it. And if you're over 40 and you want to become strong, fit, and lean without going to the gym, download my free ebook in the first link in the description. Grüezi miteinander, Gregory von Lebe Stark here. Let's jump right in. When it comes to strength and muscle, we have 6 studies that seem to confirm that you're able to gain strength, power gains, as well as explosive performance with swings and snatches. I would take it to the next level and say that it's not just about gaining explosiveness from swings and snatch, but also from the jerk. I think the jerk is the most explosive exercise that you can do. There's also data that seems to point out that kettlebell training can protect against muscle loss, aging, and sarcopenia, which is evident as when you're getting older, you want to make sure that you're not losing those strength gains, because strength evaporates very quickly as we age. So making sure that we swing some bells is a must. Then we talk about fat loss and cardio. We have 7 studies that seem to confirm that kettlebells can match or beat traditional cardio. And I can tell you that this is going to be a different video, but right now I'm able to track my kettlebell workouts with the Apple Watch, but stay tuned for the way how I do it, that I currently seem to burn close to 600 calories per workout. And if we say it's plus minus, let's say like 10 or 20%, it's still, let's say 400 or 500 calories, which is massive. And it's not just completely strength endurance training that I do. I use a lot of heavy bells and double bells, but it seems to point out that we can burn lots of calories when it comes to kettlebell training. Of course, if you are then in a caloric deficit, all these kettlebell workouts help you to stay in that caloric deficit, you're in for some awesome fat loss. And of course, you're able to build massive cardio. Then when it comes to joint health and injury prevention, we have 5 studies. And it seems to be that certain exercises can improve shoulder stability, such as the Turkish get-up, even though I'm not a big fan of this exercise. I think a press or a jerk or a snatch can do this as well. But this was the particular exercise that they used. And we have a lot of core and hip engagement when it comes to bottom-up carries and swings and snatch because of the unilateral aspect of training. And it also seems to be able to reduce injury risk. And then when we compare kettlebells versus Olympic lifting, there are 15 studies that I read that say the following. You have similar power and similar muscle gains, but you have a lower injury risk when it comes to kettlebells, which is obvious because the weight that you're using is not that high like in Olympic weightlifting. I would also say that while kettlebells require for you to build a certain skill, it is not the same level of skill that is required to do a heavy barbell snatch, for example. And it's safer on the joints, especially for aging lifters. Then we have rotational and core strength, and I have gathered 6 studies that seems to confirm that it enhances abdominal strength and trunk mobility, and we can attest to this, especially when it comes to the snatch. Every single muscle fiber is trained in your body, as well as this rotational power and this rotational training that you're getting into because it's a unilateral aspect. And yes, we can even include the windmill, where this is a typical rotational exercise, or that's an exercise that includes a typical rotational element. But at the end of the day, if you have a unilateral training where you only work with one side, and the kettlebell seems to cross match the body, where if you snatch with the right side, you get a lot of activation with the lower body on the left side, the left glute, the left hamstring, and the right arm is then doing the overhead top fixation, which seems to include some powerful and great rotational and rotational core strength. Then we have athletic performance and balance. I have found 5 studies that seem to indicate that the kettlebell can improve power, balance, and strength, symmetry, and it is versatile. You can use the kettlebell for your GPP for almost any sport. Then we have mobility and flexibility. I have found 4 studies that say that the kettlebell can increase range of motion and tissue elasticity. And I think tissue elasticity is a big one, especially with the snatch and the jerk or the general ballistic exercises, because we lose this tissue elasticity as we age, which can wreak havoc in our bodies. And it is essential for active aging and lifelong fitness. And many folks over 40, 50, and 60 gravitate towards kettlebells because it gives you such a high ROI, not just in our gym, but also on YouTube. The data seems to be clear. So we can conclude that science seems to confirm that the kettlebell has powerful and great benefits, and it's ideal for strength, fitness, and longevity, especially after 40. I have to say, though, that some of these studies use methods that I would have used differently. Many of these studies use only a 16 kg, they use an athletic population, and they use people who probably need heavier weights, or you should include a cohort that doesn't really train, that isn't really active, and that gains great benefits with lighter weights. But these people are hard to find and hard to recruit for a study. But at the end of the day, I think the data seems to be clear. Now let's talk about Stu McGill's swing, snatch, and bottom-ups carry study. So let me share you the key points of this study. And I think this is the one particular research paper that I recommend for you to read in full. I'm going to give you the key elements right now. So McGill states that some athletes love kettlebell swings for performance and therapy, and others experience back discomfort. This is interesting. We have seen and experienced that some people seem to have some issues with certain ballistic movements, which might be that maybe certain tendons or certain tissues of the body cannot handle this explosive or fast moving, these rapid movements that are happening when you are using ballistic movements, and then your body has to stabilize it quickly. Athletes like Bruce Lee and Brett Gillingham highlight kettlebells for strength, rehab, and athleticism. And the Bruce Lee take, I think, is great. I love Bruce Lee, but aside from this study and aside from this one quote that McGill has in that particular study, that Bruce Lee was apparently using kettlebells, or at least he had a gym and there were kettlebells around there, I don't have any other information provided that Bruce was actually training with kettlebells. If that is the case, I'd really love to, but the information seems to be very scarce. So there seems to be limited biomechanical data, and that's the reason why McGill was motivated to study the kettlebell when it comes to spine loading and muscle activation. And I think the study was in 2012 or 2013. And he was using a couple of folks, I think college athletes, as well as Pavel Tsatsouline. And so with Pavel, he had some interesting findings, which I'm going to elaborate a little bit further. So here are the major findings. When it comes to muscle activation, there's high glute and moderate low back activation, and the spine loading seems to be intense, and there are notable shear forces that are unique to swings and not to the snatch. This is interesting. And the shear loading happens in the backswing portion of the lift, not at the top swing. And that's the reason, because the kettlebell wants to travel back and it seems to pull your spine apart, whereas when the kettlebell reaches the top swing, you're able to stabilize it, and the kettlebell has this shift where gravity sets in and then there's this floating phase. So the shear forces don't seem to be high at the top swing. This is against popular belief. And then he talks about that keymate technique that Bruce Lee is using as well, and Pavel seems to use as well. Now, we don't have no scientific background when it comes to this keymate technique, and I do not use it in my kettlebell training at all. Granted, I'm using some higher muscle activation when I do a heavy kettlebell swing with the 64 kg, for example, but I'm not going balls to the walls trying to force 200% of my strength into a 24 kg or even a 32. I'm just using the proper tension required to move that weight. And the conclusion is quantitative support confirms the kettlebell benefits in strength, athleticism, and rehab if properly executed. So McGill's study also seems to point out that we have some great benefits and the data seems to back it up. Now, what were the exercise that he tested? He was using the swing, the snatch, and carries. And it's interesting that he says they're using also the swing with the kime, which I think there's no scientific base for this, just swing the weight, and then a swing to snatch. And I would just consider this a snatch. The wording is interesting. And granted that Pavel was part of the study, I don't know how much he was included. But if you would ask me, hey, should I name the exercise swing to snatch? I would say no. Just call it a snatch. Because if you're using a snatch without momentum, I would call it or coin it a dead snatch or a power snatch. Just as a little side note. So they were preparing those athletes that had to train or had to do the exercise with proper form. And with the swing, they had a neutral spine. They were starting in that squat or hinge position. And they had a lot of hip, knee, ankle extension, which is normal with that exercise. And so with the kime swing, which seems to be not scientifically supported, he says at the top of the swing, there is an abdominal pulse at chest height. And that's just major muscle activation. And I'm not saying just because there's no scientific evidence for this that this is not real. But the benefits or the results of it, I don't know what you're getting out of it. McGill even states, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later in this video, that there seems to be an issue with that so-called super stiffness, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Then the snatch is where you swing the kettlebell into an overhead lockout, and you start with the same initiation like with the swing. And with the carries, he was doing bottom ups, he was doing in a rack position compared to no weight and walking. So here are the major results. So muscle activation, the back, the peak is at the start, so that's 30% of the swing, significant but controlled. The abs are working, the glutes are working, and the glutes have the highest peak, a very strong hip extension at the top of the swing. And that's typical for the hardstyle method. I don't think this is required. I don't think you have to really force every single muscle fiber into the exercise. Granted, every single muscle fiber gets trained, but if you're not aiming for maximum explosiveness, which I think you can even get better results with a jerk, I don't think you have to do it, but you can, of course. I don't think you have to worry about it unless you have issue with that super stiffness that we're going to talk about. So you have, when you use that kime, that typical hardstyle swing, you have an increased external oblique activation at the swing. And they analyzed Pavel's technique. And when they analyzed Pavel's technique, they saw that he had a high speed spine motion and he had a 150% of the, how do they call it? The maximum voluntary contraction of the back. So it seems like Pavel was able to contract 150% of his back muscles. And this is interesting because if you're able to contract 100% of your back muscles, I mean, that's the max, right? So if it goes above, what does that even mean? It's interesting. And he was able to 100% or activate his glutes to 100%. Now, this seems to be beneficial for elite athleticism or if you're really looking for this type of explosive strength, but it might be risky for folks with back issues because here's what happens. You're not able to make the weight heavier. A 24 or 32 remains that weight, but you are able to put more force into the weight, which means you have a higher velocity or a higher speed that you can create. So there's more kinetic. You're throwing so much force into the exercise, which doesn't make the weight heavier, but there is more contraction and more power moving in. And what then happens is there is a motion at the spine level, or these muscles or the spine and all by itself gets into this rapid motion because you're accelerating so fast. And once you reach the top swing, you then have to break that kinetic energy that's coming, because if you don't, you're just going into an hyperextension. So you have to lock the knees, you have to contract the glutes, and you have to contract your braking muscles at the front. So that's the abdominals and the quads. And what then happens is this causes the spine to rapidly move. And don't forget, we have now seen that these shear forces are high in the backswing. So when they are high in the backswing and you're not able to tolerate it in the backswing where there's not a lot of force, where you're actually catching the weight, then when you go from this backswing portion into the top swing, this might cause some trouble. So the way I recommend it is to make sure that you either use the pendulum method, or you don't use that much force going into the lift, or you wait until you're fully conditioned to do it. So the study goals were to quantify spine loads, muscle activation in these exercises, and the unique findings are that unique findings of the studies are that you have high posterior shear force and versus compression compared to a barbell. And that's interesting, or that's obvious actually, because the barbell, you move it in a dynamic, slow, and controlled fashion. Even if you move it faster, you don't have this swinging motion of the exercise, and the weight doesn't travel that far. So yes, that's the reason why we have more posterior shear forces. And what I love about the carry exercise is he says that with the carry exercise, you can train the QL muscle, the quadratus lumborum. And that's a deep-seated muscle that connects your spine to your hip. And he says that many people who have back issues have a weak QL muscle. So with the suitcase carry, you might train an important muscle to help you fight off or fight against back pain. And the last thing that he says is people move bad in general. So he says it's not just about the exercise that you're doing that might cause some issues, or you might not tolerate the swing, but he says people have an issue with moving biomechanically correct in everyday life. Now, this doesn't mean that you're supposed to train and that you're supposed to move like a robot, but it probably means that you have to be a little bit more aware of your body. I just recently had a client where it took a long time to teach him the hinge. And the hinge, which is evident in the swing, the clean, and the snatch, even if you're using the pendulum, the hinge is a requirement to understand how to work with your hips. When you do not understand how to bend and actually use your hips without squatting, just being able to work your strongest muscles, the glutes and hamstrings properly, then you're always offsetting the brunt of the weight that you're lifting. If you're just carrying groceries or you're just moving around in general, then you're always offsetting that weight to your lower back. And these are stabilizer muscles. They're not supposed to take the brunt of the weight like the glutes and the hamstrings are supposed to. That's why they're saying, there's this saying, you have to lift with your legs. But if you do not know how to properly cue and control your strongest muscles, then you always offset the weight to your weaker muscles, which might cause issues. So I highly recommend for you to read through McGill's study. I reference it almost on a, let's say, a weekly basis, because I continuously see more stuff in that study that I think is interesting. And as a conclusion, we can say that the data seems to back it up. The data seems to back up the fact that the kettlebell has so many powerful and great benefits. And if you want to read up on all these studies, you have to check the description. And this is the end of the video. And I have to say that I am interested in maybe one day, somewhere down the line, maybe do a study myself and see how we can quantify results and these ideas based on the experience that I was able to gather. But maybe that's a little bit too early to say. But I'm definitely interested in moving a little bit into the research and scientific realm to see how we can further push and kick the ball down the road when it comes to kettlebells and research. So here's the next thing that you have to do. Clean and press that like and subscribe button. Share with a friend who's also interested in kettlebells. And if you made it this far, download my free ebook in the first link in the description called the Kettlebell Code. If you're over 40, 50, or 60, you don't have a lot of time, but you still want to take care of your fitness, this is where the kettlebell comes in. And I have a great shortcut for you, and that is my free ebook. So download it right now in the first link in the description or in the pinned comment.